Okay, so today we are talking about time, and time is a little bit like space that we discussed last week. So time is something which frames and organizes our lives in very important ways, just like space, but often goes unexamined because we very much take it for granted. We take it for granted because it's an aspect of our lives, and we are so accustomed to calendars and clocks and particular ways of talking about time that we hardly give it a critical attention. And this picture here shows one of the very common ways in our society to see time, as discussed by Delany in the chapter All We Have Is Time that you read for this week. So if you look at this picture for a moment, you can start thinking, what did she say about some of the common ways in our society to think about time? How does this picture describe what she was talking about? In our society, we think of time as something quantifiable, so something you can count. And here you can see certainly, the 12 hours, 1 hour, 360 minutes, 360 seconds is something that we can't count. This also means that it's something that is external to ourselves. It is something that proceeds, continues on, even if we're not thinking about it, right? It's external, is a time that is perhaps universal, that goes on for everyone and for everything. It is also homogeneous. So all minutes are of the same duration, all hours are of the same duration. So it has a sense of objectivity. It's always the same. And it's also something that is similar to a possession. And I think this is what the picture does very well as well. It is something that we can spend, we can save, we can use it all up, we can divide time up and assign it to different things. Like, for example, we devote 1 hour to this lecture. And as Delany describes, of course, time is money. That's why this picture shows a time bank. If in our society, time is very often equated to money, then Delany reminds us that there are many different ways of thinking about time that might be different than that. And in fact, one of the ways of starting to reflect on time as something culturally constructed is to look at different ways of understanding times in different communities and different cultures. One of the things that she mentioned is that we could think about time as a sort of a river, so a continuous movement, or a river that always brings new water, that is never the same. Another interesting example or metaphor that she mentioned is the idea of time as a gift. She has this great question in her chapter, what if we saw time as a gift rather than time as money? How would it make a difference? Would it be a gift from generation to generation, for example? Would it make a difference in the way we live time and we think about time? Another way of thinking about time is as a pendulum that swings back and forth. So a sort of alternating between very different states or very different events. We can think of the alternating of days and nights, and an alternating, for example, from high tide to low tide. For people who live in coastal communities or on islands, people who perhaps relies on fishing, the high tide and low tide might be a very important ways to think about time. And here I really want to point out that the alternating of states and events, like alternating of high and low tides, could be a dominant way of understanding time in a particular society, but it is also, of course, a way of understanding time that is important in our society as well. Another example of an alternating calendar, or a calendar that is divided into two very different seasons, is one of Venur. And you might remember we talked about Venur in the last week when we talked about space. They are pastoral people living in South Sudan. And when Evans Pritchard was doing research among Venur, he spent a lot of time talking about their calendar and ideas of time. And he described how Venur have two main seasons, Mai and Tot. And Mai is a dry season that is associated with the decline of rains. And it is associated with life in cattle camps. While Tot is a wet season when Nur build villages on ridges so that they are on dry land, and they grow millet and other crop around their villages. So this is a really nice example of an alternating view of time. And because we see the contrast between two very different seasons, it might be attempting to simplify it and say, well, it's a really simple idea of time. You either have the rains or you have a dry season. But Evans Pritchard actually did a really good job of explaining just how subtle some of these changing states can be. And he did a really good job of really describing what it felt like for Venur to go from one state to the next. So I want to read a quick quote from his book Venur about it. He writes, "The two seasons only approximate our division into rains and drought. And the Venur classification summarize their way of looking at the movement of time, the direction of attention in marginal months being as significant as the actual climatic conditions. So the direction of attention in the months that are kind of between the rains and the dry seasons are also really important." He says, "In the middle of September, Nur turn, as it were, towards the life of fishing and cattle camps and feel that village residence and horticulture lie behind them. They begin to speak of camps as though they were already as though they were already in being and long to be on the move. Their restlessness is even more marked towards the end of a drought, when noting cloudy skies, people turn towards the life of villages and make preparations for striking camp. Marginal months, or months in between, may therefore be classed as Tot or Mai, since they belong to one set of activities but presage the other set, for the concept of seasons is derived from social activities rather than from the climatic changes which determine them. And a year is to Venur a period of village residence and a period of camp residence." So it's a direction of attention towards a different kind of activities, being in villages or being in cattle camps, which gives Nuer the sense of a change is coming and the very meaning of Tot and the very meaning of Mai, what they understand with it. Another example of an alternating calendar is the one in Simbo on the Solomon Island. And Burman describes that the calendar for Simbo people was very much determined by different Canarian nuts that were ripening in different time. So they, so to speak, gave shape to time. And this alternating of different harvests of Scanarium nuts also went with different directions of winds on the islands, and also different places where people fished, different sides of the islands where people fished. This is because of the winds that were hitting the islands in different directions, and also different fishing practices. There was fishing during the day versus fishing during the night in the two different seasons. So this is also a really good example of alternating time. And of course, when we think about time as alternating of states, I'm also thinking of our week and how it is strongly divided for many of us between weekdays and weekends. And perhaps before the pandemic, that was more the case than it is now, but still, that is another example. Delaney also talks about time as a recurring cycle, a cycle of festivities, a cycle of event. We can think about it also as a seasonal food cycle. And she mentions Australian Aboriginal people who kept a flower time. So they knew the time of the year by the kind of flowers that were blooming at the time. And this was important also because it told them which food they could gather and when they could collect honey. And for me, growing up in northern Italy, this seasonal food cycle was very important because, I associated certain seasons with certain foods. For example, fall has always been for me the season of chestnuts and the season of mushrooms, because it is very much like that in North Italian culture or society, at least a few years ago. Now food is much more available in all seasons. But thinking about that, look at these different foods that grow at different times. I will give you a moment to think. Can you actually arrange them in a seasonal calendar? Is a seasonal calendar important to you? And if it is, in which ways? Perhaps some of you are gardeners, and then it might be really important. And a wider question for you is, what kind of calendars are important to you, and in which ways? Another interesting thing to talk about in relation to time and how time is culturally constructed is cultural variations in understanding the way we imagine the past and the future. And now I would like you to close your eyes for a minute and think about this. If you think about the future, where would you put it? Would you put the future in front of you, or would you put the future behind you? Point in Delaney that I want to highlight here is that we think about time very often as being linear and progressive. So we think of time as something that has a beginning. It could be the Big Bang. It could be just any sort of beginning that we think happened at the beginning of time. And then that progresses continuously, almost like in a straight line towards an ending or towards a point that we don't know when it is or what it is. And she says that rather than imagining time as a line that progressive, however, we could also imagine time as something different. We could imagine time as a deep layered phenomenon, and this is a quote from her, in which the present moment was not just the end result of all that preceded it, but also contained all what went before. Past in this view is co-present, whereas for us, past is past. So this was Delaney from page 92. And I imagine what she's talking about a little bit like a chocolate cake with many layers. So we could think also of time as each layer of time being existing in the present at the same time. So time is a deep layered phenomenon. And she mentioned the Australian Indigenous people for whom the dream time is like, the dream time, the time in which the land was created and shaped, is actually still present today. It's almost like a layer of time that inhabits people's ideas, people's relation to the land. It's right there. And it is hard for us, or at least for me, to imagine this. I have a really hard time imagining time as a deep layered phenomenon, and I imagine much easier time as something that is linear and progressive. And this is also an example of how culture does not just give meaning to experiences, in this case shaping ideas of times and ways in which we adapt those ideas to our daily life, but also makes it harder to imagine different things, blinds us to other meanings. And when we think of the past inhabiting the present at the same time, Basso, who did research with the Western Apaches, has a similar example, has something similar to that. So Basso described how he was involved in a collaborative mapping project in the community of Sibekwe, and how it worked is that he went around with people of the community, and they brought him to very specific places and taught him the place names of those places. So place names would be something like water lies with mud in an open container, as you can see here, which have a sort of description of either some characteristic of a place or of a story that goes with that place. And the job of Basso was to not just take pictures of these places, not just to produce maps, but also to record place names, and very importantly, to learn to pronounce them correctly. And what he learned from the Apaches, what the Apaches told him, is that the landscape is actually a living memory of what the ancestors saw, what they did, and the way they spoke when they saw certain landmarks. And this is a way of approaching space, but it's also very much a way of approaching time. Because to say it simply, each time an Apaches person that Basso worked with was in a particular place and recognized it through its name, they were in a way standing in the past, because they were seeing it through their ancestors' experiences and eyes, and they were calling it with the same name that the ancestors were calling it with. Mann has a really interesting interpretation of this. So I will read you what she says. And here you see one of these places. For example, this is water flows down on top of a regular succession of flat rocks. And this really describes, again, what the ancestors said when they saw the place. So whenever we are repeating place names, the person who stands there and repeats a place name is also, in a sense, at the same place and time as the ancestral beings or the ancestors. So let me read you this analysis of Mann, which is really nice. She says, names identify viewing points in front of places. As persons imagine themselves standing in front of a named site, they may imagine themselves standing in the ancestors' tracks, so literally the footprints of the ancestors. By taking the ancestor's position, a viewer transforms an ancestral there and then into their own here and now. Incorporated into the latter, the viewer's biographies, ancestral events then become a particular form of lived history. So this was Munn describing Basso's research and what he learned about space and time. And what I also really like about this idea is that it is a relation with the past, but it's also in a sense an orientation towards the future. Because as Basso writes, the teaching gained by standing in the ancestors' footprints and, so to speak, sharing in their time frame also ensure future well-being and the attainment of vision, of wisdom, because it is a way of learning about things that will be important in the future. So the very simple activity of going to a place like water flows down on top of a regular succession of flat rocks and uttering these place names is something that unites the future, the past, and the present in this kind of chocolate cake where time is one layer among many.